Hello and welcome to everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. This is the second webinar of today, and it's focusing on careers in climate policy. So we'll be looking at how climate policy works, but more importantly, how you can build a career that influences climate action at national and international levels. So I'm delighted that we have three amazing panelists with us today, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. I'll first start with Adaku Ufere, and she's an energy policy and investment leader that works across Africa. So welcome, Adaku.
Thank you.
I'd next like to welcome Sam Ralph. Sam is a UK government expert in clean energy policy. So welcome, Sam.
No
And
problem.
hi. And then finally, I'd like to welcome Emma Camp. And Emma is a marine scientist translating research into real world reef solutions. So welcome, Emma. Great. So, before we begin, let's just get a sense of who's in the room. So we're going to start with our first poll. And that poll is going to look at what best describes your current stage in your career. Okay, so I think so we've got quarter of the group here are early career professionals. We have some students, career changer, and mid-senior professionals. That's nearly half the group. So welcome everyone. We are delighted that you're with us today. So we're going to kick off by setting the scene a little bit on climate policy landscape. So we know that climate policy operates across global agreements, national priorities, and local realities. But for many, it can feel quite abstract. So if I could just start with one question for all our panelists. What do you feel are the key forces shaping climate policy today? And I'll start with Adaku and then go to Sam, and then Emma. So, Adaku, what do you think?
Personally, I think a lot of climate policy is being shaped by, honestly, who has the money.
Mm,
So I work in a donor environment. I work on donor-funded projects. And typically, you're given, conditions when you're given a grant or a contract. And when you're the one receiving the money, it's
mm,
difficult to dictate, how it's going to be designed.
mm,
And typically what we'd expect is that the funder meets the implementer on the ground. What are the local solutions? And let's apply international practices to it. But a lot of times the rules are so rigid around how a grant is governed or implemented that sadly you're just serving interests in Washington or New York or
mm,
Paris or somewhere, and then the average person in Nigeria or Ghana or Cameroon is not
mm,
really getting what they need. They get a nice, document saying
mm.
strategy, this is, what you should be doing, but they can't apply it to their environment. And so I personally think that's the problem.
Okay, thank you for that. Over to you, Sam. What do you think?
So I think the change that I'm seeing in climate policy from the UK context, I work on UK climate policy in the kind of domestic space rather than international. But I think the key change is that we're seeing a framing shift towards energy security as a
Mm,
driver of the need to invest in clean energy in the UK.
yeah.
And I think there's two potential reasons for that. Firstly, in the UK context and possibly in other countries as well,
Mm,
we are seeing that there is no longer a broad political consensus for net zero in climate action. So
mm,
there used to be the two main parties in the UK very much working towards a similar goal on net zero by 2050. That
yeah.
has now shifted. So that means that the kind of framing of the problem needs to shift as well.
Mm,
Um, I would also say that this is why the UK and Britain sees our kind of domestic mission on delivering clean power by 2030 and net zero by 2050 is really crucial to our kind of international engagement as a country as well. So I think we see the kind of the continued focus in the UK on delivering clean energy and climate action as kind of a way to be a leader on climate policy internationally as well.
Thank you. So just that intersect between international and how that can influence national drivers. Thank you for that, Sam. And over to you, Emma, for your thoughts.
So for where I'm at in Australia, I think we're also seeing some of the points that Sam spoke about. But I think for me, in my role in a scientific capacity, it's definitely seeing like how scientific consensus is trying to come together to actually influence change and influence policy. And there's more dialogue happening, at least here in Australia, between science and politicians to try to actually translate and help like move the dial. We've known that the challenges that are existing for the environment, we've known the threats of climate change, but historically that's not transitioning to the climate action that we need to see from a political standpoint. And as Adaku's highlighted, that's, you know, often the challenge is the financial drivers and the political will to do that. So the question then is, how do those of us that are creating the evidence, the scientific community, adapt to try to create that translation and to provide more, you know, force, if you like, to say that actually we need that political will to shift and change. So there's a lot happening in that space here. And I think even though it's not climate related, but seeing, say, the High Seas Treaty go through and see lots of organisations and like really pushing for governments to come together for this collective policy change, to see that that can happen shows that there is the capacity for ground on the ground change to lead to real like impact at these higher levels.
Yeah, thank you. So some really important and factors that you've all addressed and challenges ranging from, you know, finance to international, national drivers and the importance of dialogue. So I've now got just a specific question for you all. So Adaku, so with global partnerships, how do you feel that they influence national energy decisions in practice?
I'll say the honest answer is slowly, messily, and with a lot of variation by country. And that's not saying they don't move the needle, they do. And the clearest example I can offer is Mission 300. So this is an initiative that I currently coordinate with Sustainable Energy for All, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Rockefeller Foundation, and GIAP. And the goal of Mission 300 is to connect 300 million people in sub-Saharan Africa to electricity by 2030. So what makes this instructive from a policy perspective is that this partnership does not sit above the national governments. It actually works through them. Each participating country has developed a national compact, which is a government-owned roadmap for electricity access that aligns our national priorities with international financing. So that kind of is working to solve the problem I highlighted earlier. So the partnership does not dictate. What it does is it actually co-designs the government and then backs it with capital. And so I would say in practice, the influence operates at three levels. First of all, it's going to shift what governments treat as financeable when the World Bank and AFDB signal co-investment interest in the wider world. It's also going to unlock domestic budget commitment and draw in private sector interest that would not otherwise exist. Secondly, it creates accountability structures. We have these delivery units called compact delivery and monitoring units, and they're embedded inside national governments, staffed by national governments. And what they do is to track implementation of the compact. And third, it builds human capacity over time. So all the civil servants running these units become more sophisticated interlocutors, for future partnerships. And not just in the work I do now, in my earlier work, leading USAID, Power Africa, West Africa Energy Program across 23 countries in Africa, I saw the exact same pattern. The most durable wins did not come from where the external partner was imposing a solution, but from where the partnership created conditions, both financial, institutional, and technical, for governments to move on decisions that they already wanted to make, but they lacked the tools or the resources to execute. So in a nutshell, global partnerships, they influence national decisions by reducing the cost and the risk of acting. They provide cover for politically difficult reforms, and they create institutional infrastructure that outlasts any single project.
Yeah. Thank you for that really comprehensive answer. And I think, again, it's that partnerships and where that fits within the ecosystem. So not having making sure that there's an intersect and a balance. Thank you very much. So going to Sam, you talked a little bit around the UK context and your work in clean energy. So how do you feel that national commitments can translate into government policy?
Yeah, so we had the 2015 Paris Agreement, and this is kind of and the climate agreement at an international level before that, and this was translated into the Climate Change Act in the UK in 2008, and the amendments have happened to that since then. And we were one of the first countries to have a kind of domestic legislation in place to deliver on the international agreements on climate. And that's been emulated, I believe, by over 60 countries around the world. So I think that's a key way in which international commitments kind of turn into government priorities in the domestic and international space. So behind the Climate Change Act, we have a carbon budget system. So we have 5-year carbon budgets that the government is legally mandated to meet, and we have to set out plans for how we're going to do that through policy. And just to shout out the specific bit of work that I do, so there are various strategies under that kind of high-level carbon budgets delivery plan. We have in the UK, we're also looking at the role of industrial policy now through the industrial strategy, where the government is looking how it can actively support the clean energy sector in the UK to help meet our international agreements and our Climate Change Act obligations. And then what I work on in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero in the UK is on workforce. So we've also now published a jobs plan for the clean energy sector in the UK, which sets out a really ambitious goal of delivering a doubling of the size of the workforce in the clean energy sector in the UK to help support our mission on delivering clean power and net zero by 2050.
Great, thank you, Sam. So a really clear trajectory of milestones and targets and action. And so I guess the challenge is meeting them and ensuring that we keep on track. But thank you for your response. And lastly, to Emma, you talked a little bit already about how science really needs to be a crucial part of dialogue and for policy to be informed. How do you feel global frameworks can shape scientific and conservation work?
So I think the frameworks are really crucial because they ultimately are a way to get consensus on where effort's going to be directed, and that's political will and in turn funding. And so it's also a way for those of us that are on the ground, whether it's scientists, whether or not it's communities. So one of my research programs here, as an example, Coral Nurture program, works with the Indigenous communities and the tourism industry to undertake coral restoration. So it was a co-designed project that we collectively established, and that fits in to the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically was came about because there was funding that linked from some of the UN sort of frameworks through to Australian initiatives, and in turn gave us like capacity. But it also gives a way for these on the ground activities to track back and show impact. And so you can see, for example, if you go on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals website, a collection of local action that are tracked, that are contributing and showing. So it's a way to also feel connected to a global movement, and beyond just the activities that you're doing yourself. And I think again, it's that so if we take something like the Sustainable Development Goals, to get countries to agree to those priorities, it takes time, and so again, there is a commitment, albeit not policy at that point in time, but it provides that foundation and that architecture for which government, but also businesses can look to say, okay, we see that this is a priority. It's a priority for multiple nations, so therefore this should be somewhere that we're invested in. And we see a lot of the time the funding that comes to us for research projects that's made available is mapped, or we are expected to map to these frameworks.
Thank you. So helpful. The global frameworks are helpful, and they do shape the very important work. Thank you. So that's the first part of the webinar. So that was really setting out the scene of climate policy and the landscape. We're now going to focus on careers and career pathways. So we'll find out a bit more around your journey. But we're going to have another poll, and this is going to highlight which path our audience is most interested in. So let's just wait for the poll to come up. There we go. So we've got government, international organizations, NGOs, advocacy, private sector, research, academia, and still exploring. Okay, so what's coming up the most is international organizations, and then followed by research, academia, quite closely followed by private sector, and then NGOs and government. So thank you very much for those responses. So I think the question for our panelists is whether or not you can just briefly share your career journey. How did you get into climate policy or climate-related work? And if I could start with you, Emma, and then go to Sam, and then Adaku.
So I was always passionate about science, particularly about coral reefs and the ocean. And if I'm really honest, didn't ever expect that I would be involved in kind of climate policy, ocean policy, and it was never the career path I set out. But I guess through undertaking the research, particularly looking at the impacts of climate change on these critical marine systems, and in turn the communities that were being impacted by the loss of these systems, I found myself in rooms, sitting at tables, in scenarios where, as a scientist, my opinion was being asked in relation to then policy decisions that were being made. And so for me, it was sort of taking those opportunities, but also being, I guess, really clear where the scientific evidence landed versus where your opinions are, and also having to adapt and to understand where my comfort level was in sort of being a voice for the field and for science versus kind of the opinions of Emma Camp. And I kind of realised quite quickly that it's a way to have impact. And so actually to be able to contribute to advisory panels, to sit at UN events and talk about the impacts that the climate change is having on these critical marine systems, on human rights related to the loss of these ecosystems. And so as I saw that was a way to kind of translate the knowledge into impact, I guess I invested more time into seeking out these opportunities, networking, and that's led me more to being in this, in this policy advisory
Yeah.
role, which, yeah, I really enjoy, but was definitely not something that I linearly started out
Yeah.
trying to get to.
Well, thank you, Emma. And the same question to Sam.
Yeah, so I think similar to Emma in some ways, I think I started from an interest, passion in wanting to contribute in some way to climate action, to protecting the environment, but also I think I've always done policy roles, wanting to play a role in something. I'm trying to solve, some of our biggest problems, and climate change is one of our biggest problems we have as a planet and as individual countries as well.
Yeah.
My career journey, which I would emphasize for kind of government roles, this is quite normal, is I started in a environmental business association, so representing businesses work delivering environmental goods and services, and I think that gave me a really useful kind of understanding of the challenges that businesses face that are delivering kind of crucial services that governments and people need to kind of deliver on our climate ambitions. So I then moved to Department for Environment in the UK government, and I've had a range of roles across environment and climate change. So I started in circular economy policy. I spent many years doing trees and forestry, taking part in England's tree planting programme, and now moved over to the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero in UK government, where I'm leading on our skills policy for the clean energy sector. So I think I'd emphasise that there's many ways to get into climate policy. I think being a policy professional really benefits from having a range of kind of roles and approaching challenges from different ways. But I think it's also been really beneficial for me to have this kind of theme to my career. Well, I'm always trying to pursue something in the climate environment space, and that gives me a really good grounding that I can take into any role that I do.
Brilliant. So a real range there of climate experience, but all kind of building on that pathway that you've had. Thank you. And Adaku.
Right. So I want to be candid about my own path because it was not linear and it was not planned in the way that career advice often implies.
Yeah.
So I'm a lawyer. I trained as an oil and gas lawyer. I spent years as a legal counsel at GE Oil and Gas, a General Electric company in Nigeria. And then I moved to Equatorial Guinea, and I was the head of the energy practice at Centurion Law Group, working across Equatorial Guinea and several other markets. So that was an entirely commercial career in hydrocarbon. And then in 2018, I made a deliberate pivot into clean energy and development. And this was driven by a values decision. It wasn't a tactical career move by any means possible. And it was basically me saying, okay, I built this great career in oil and gas. I've won awards. I've done landmark, projects, but I couldn't see how what I did drilled down to the individual person. Like I couldn't see the social impact of the work I was doing.
Yeah.
And I thought, and honestly, at that time, I didn't see the energy transition. I didn't expect that would happen. Oil and gas was still, oil was still king back in 2017. And so it was just something I thought it was a natural progression I could make in my career. But then what made that transition possible was recognizing the skills I had built: contract negotiation, regulatory analysis, deal structuring, stakeholder management across multiple jurisdictions. They were all genuinely transferable. Those were not oil and gas skills. They were high value professional skills that happened to just be applied in oil and gas. So when I reframed them that way, I became competitive for roles in international development that I might otherwise have assumed were not for someone with my background. So moving on from that, the role that changed my trajectory was when I was chief of party on the USAID Power Africa West Africa Energy Program, with Deloitte Consulting. So I'm the first African to hold that title on the USAID Power Africa program. And that role gave me such amazing program management credibility at scale. I oversaw 150 staff across 23 countries, and I manage a budget of $74 million.
Wow.
And so that's the currency that multilateral organizations recognize. And so I'll say, and then now I've moved on to Sustainable Energy for All, which is a UN entity under UNO. And in this role, I manage renewable energy projects and energy access projects.
Yeah.
And so I'll say practical advice for those targeting international or multilateral roles. Identify the transferable core of what you already do. So not the sector-specific wrapping.
Yeah.
Then get close to the work through fellowships, secondments, or advisory roles before expecting a permanent post. I did about 3 different fellowships. I was a Mandela Washington Fellow under the U.S. State Department. I'm an Obama Foundation leader for Africa. I'm also a Power Africa Fellow, and I was able to build amazing networks through these programs.
Yeah.
And you should also build a regional or thematic reputation. Multilaterals don't hire generalists at senior levels. They hire people known for something specific.
Yeah.
And then you should genuinely become bilingual about a problem, be able to speak to the technical substance as well as the political economy around it.
Yeah. Wow, that's really inspiring. So, and a lot of practical advice then. Really interesting how you mentioned it's not just linear, and also that values. Thinking about the social impact of what we do within, addressing climate change, and I think that's something that really brings together this community across global and national levels. So thank you very much to all our panelists on that particular question around career pathways. We're now going to move and drill down even more practically and think about entry routes and required skills. So we have one final poll, and I hope that everyone in the audience can see that poll. The question here is, what do you feel is your biggest challenge entering this field? Is it lack of experience, not knowing where to start, lack of relevant skills, limited network, or switching careers? We've got the responses in. 33% saying it's a limited network, and then 24% of you saying not knowing where to start. And then we've got 17% saying a lack of experience, and then a lack of relevant skills and switching careers at 13%. So I think even having an awareness of all those challenges can support in trying to find the career pathway that is important and matters to you. So I'm going to now ask our panelists some questions on skills, and let's see how helpful these can hopefully be for our audience. So, Sam, just based on your experience, what skills do you feel are most valued in policy roles today?
So I think there are loads of different ways that you can approach a policy role. So I wouldn't want to give a kind of definitive list, but I think some skills that I see as important, particularly for the kind of roles that I've done and maybe the way that I work in policy. First of all, it's having analytical rigor. So policy is inherently multidisciplinary. You work with economists, social researchers, lawyers, commercial experts, etc. So I think as a policy professional, having the ability to kind of bring together all the evidence and the expertise that you have, weigh the trade-offs between different options and make recommendations is a really important skill.
Yeah.
Secondly, stakeholder management. So we make policy in partnership with industry, business, other parts of government, local government, international governments, and of course partners internationally as well. So how do you kind of manage those relationships and influence the right people to get the outcomes that you want through policy? And part of that is also communicating. So a lot of the time in policy, we're dealing with really complex technical issues, and we need to be able to provide clear advice on how a minister or the public should engage with that issue. So being able to kind of translate that technical detail into something digestible by your audience.
Yeah.
And then finally, I would say adaptability. So many kind of policy roles can be very reactive and fast moving,
Yeah.
and depending on political will of your set of ministers, for instance, and other global events can completely change a policy landscape. Like in energy, for instance, since the Middle East conflict, there's been a huge change in policy priorities, and that means that as a policy professional, you need to be comfortable with that kind of ambiguity and the need to shift to react to how things change.
Yeah, thank you. So you've mentioned quite a lot of skills there, in terms of stakeholder management, the technical side, but also having to be adaptable. So that's really interesting. Adaku, if I can come to you, Sam mentioned stakeholder management, and you've already mentioned some of the skills that you have in terms of negotiation, your legal background, and thinking about finance as well. How important do you think these skills are?
Definitely very important. These are not supplementary skills.
Right.
In the international climate and energy space, they are the actual work. So
Mm,
starting with negotiation, every single outcome in this space, whether it's a policy reform, a bilateral agreement, a financing package, a partnership framework, whatever it is, it's a product of negotiation.
yeah.
And I don't mean like formal treaty negotiations only, though that does matter. I mean like the daily discipline of understanding what different actors need, where their red lines are, how to structure agreements that hold across jurisdictions with very different institutional contexts. I use these skills every week in my current work because I'm coordinating between my company,
Yeah.
development organizations, national governments, and other partners. And then with finance, climate policy without an understanding of how money moves is incomplete, in my personal opinion. Because if you cannot read a budget, if you cannot understand a financing structure,
Yeah.
or assess whether, a proposed reform creates or destroys investment incentive, like I really believe you will struggle to
Yeah.
influence outcomes in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
I've seen very technically brilliant policy work
Yeah.
fail to translate into action because the people producing it did not understand, what was required to make it financeable.
Yeah.
And then with stakeholder management, this is perhaps like the most underrated of the three because it's not a strict discipline. It's more about personal networking.
Yeah.
Because in complex, like multi-actor environments, which is what international climate work almost always is, the ability to manage relationships across institutional cultures, seniority levels, and national context is really not a soft skill.
Yeah.
It's a strategic capability. Like you need to understand who needs to be informed, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be the visible face of a decision. And that's usually the difference between a program that delivers and one that stalls. And in the African context, we're dealing with different languages, multinational environments. People, I'll say when I worked in South Sudan, before we got anything signed, you needed to sit down and eat a communal meal with like 20 people.
Yeah.
And that was non-negotiable. And you had to be comfortable doing that.
Yeah.
In Nigeria, they like you to be direct, to be upfront, but it's very hierarchical. Everybody wants to be called star, ma, that sort of thing. In Ghana, Ghanaians are very, very polite and they're not going to tell you upfront, what you're asking, and they're never going to tell you no. So you have to understand how to manage all those competing interests across multiple jurisdictions. And, it's a skill I've developed over 16 years working in this space, but it's a skill most people just don't appreciate. They will apply the same way they work across whatever jurisdiction they're in, regardless of the local culture.
Yeah.
And so none of these really need to be perfected. Like I wasn't perfect by any means possible when I first started out, but I consciously developed these skills from early in my career till now. I'm still learning,
Yeah.
and I'm not the pinnacle by any way possible. So it's something that can be developed. You just need to work at it.
Amazing. Thank you. So again, I think Sam and Adaku, you've really been super helpful, I think, in just highlighting even the skills and really focusing on, what the career pathway that you want is and getting those building blocks and making sure that you're really career ready. And Emma, I'm going to go to you. So obviously you're a scientist, so you do have a particular skill set. But how do you what skills bridge science and policy effectively?
So I think here and some of it we've heard from Adaku and Sam as well is still really, really relevant. I think one of the biggest things is understanding where the science fits in the broader scheme of things. So yes, we create the evidence and bring that evidence, but without understanding who needs to receive that evidence, how they need to receive it. If you're trying to undertake research that's coming up with a new solution, then how would that be funded? What are the ethical and risk considerations around that? And so, we can't just have our science mind on if we want the research that we're doing to translate to impact. We have to have that broader awareness of where it fits in that scheme. I think when it comes to the climate space, and particularly for me in the marine space, there's lots of new interventions that are being considered and risk around that being discussed is a skill about how you communicate uncertainty. So with science, there is always an element of uncertainty, and for us to have trust, and that's a really key part of this ability to translate into the political space, is that people trust you,
Yeah.
and that trust comes with you being able to communicate your science, but also the level of uncertainty that it inevitably exists within that science, and that can then help policy really understand for them where the risk comes if they are to take or go or make certain decisions based on the evidence that's been putting forward. I think another thing is being able to actually listen.
Yeah.
Often, as scientists, we might have something we're really passionate about, but that actually may not be what is needed. And so actually listening to the communities, listening to government, where is the science needed? And I think if you can actually ensure that you're taking your research from the ground up, from the people that actually need it, it's an easier way to have impact, but it also helps create those networks early on. And so we see time and time again that if you haven't brought the stakeholders on board early, and then you do your research and then try and bring it to them, it's just not the right way to engage the people that you need to engage. And so for me, part of that stakeholder management that we've heard from both Sam and Adaku is very relevant as well for us in science, and
Yeah.
also about how we go about undertaking our science. So I think, yeah, they're the main things for me. And I think the last thing would be strategic thinking. As scientists, we almost need to be thinking, ahead of where we are. Like, we're the ones that are being asked to come up with the solutions, to invent the solutions that don't currently exist. And so to do that, you've really got to be, strategized, understand where the policy landscape is, understand where the funding could be, not
Yeah.
necessarily where it is now, and who are the players that you need to pull together to ultimately undertake the science. That's often interdisciplinary as well,
Yeah.
but also then to make them listen to your science, so it's not just a nice scientific paper that hopefully a few people will read, because that's not how we're going to have impact.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So before we move on to some of the Q&A, and hopefully we've got some exciting questions, just want to ask the panel, what do you feel are some of the underrated skills? I know we've been talking about that already, but if you were to really advise the audience, what would you say? Obviously technical is really important, but what do you feel, again, what you'd like to prioritize as an underrated skill? If I go to Adaku and then Sam and then Emma.
I say political literacy, like the ability to read, incentive structures and constraints that shape how governments and institutions actually behave, as
Yeah,
opposed to how they're supposed to behave. It's never taught formally, but it determines whether your policy work lands or sits on a shelf. Like I work
yeah.
out of West Africa, and in the past, 6 years, we've had maybe 5 or 6 coups or coup attempts in this
Wow.
region.
Yeah,
And every time that's a coup, it destabilizes the funding landscape because
yeah,
when I was working for the U.S. government, we're not allowed to fund unconstitutional changes, in democracy. So you pull out, how do you navigate? How do you pivot? How do you, trans and just being able to read, see it coming,
yeah,
know how to mitigate when it does happen.
yeah,
It really, like I said, it determines whether your policy work is going to land.
yeah.
So for me, political literacy is thought of as this overarching thing, but I think
Mm,
it's so important
that's
in
re
narrower contexts.
really, really important and helpful to identify that. Thank you, Daku. Sam.
Yeah, I think this has been mentioned somewhat, but I
Mm,
would say that a skill that is potentially underrated, particularly as a government policy official, is brokering compromise. So,
mm,
when you're working on a complex policy issue, I think as a government official, it's not your role to necessarily know what the answer is. It's more to
yeah,
bring together lots of different people, experts, and find something within those kind of range of opinions
yeah,
and range of evidence that you can collect. And then I think that's a skill in itself.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sam. And Emma.
I think it's realizing your value, and sometimes that value is not what maybe
Mm,
you're asked for in a given moment or a specific point. And where I mean like that is that we all have the capacity to be an enabler to somebody
yeah,
through our network or through our skill set. And
yeah,
so actually sometimes I think we may be asked to do something. I know for me sometimes I'm contacted and I think, oh, I just can't, that's not me. I'm not a soil scientist, so I can't
yeah,
answer that question, or I'm not across that. And it's a strength to say what you don't know, and
yeah,
absolutely, you shouldn't speak beyond that as a scientist. But we have networks. So I know soil scientists, I know people that I can connect
yeah,
with. And actually, if you're someone that gets a name as being an enabler and as someone that will
yeah,
connect people, will say when it's not them, but will put you in the right direction.
yeah,
I found for me that's a way to get into those rooms, to build that trust, to have those conversations, because people know they can come to you. You may not be the one that is receiving the funding or receiving the invitation to contribute to a specific policy this time, but because you're building that trust and because you're sharing those networks, they'll come
yeah.
back again. And I think that helps to open those doors for the future.
Well, thank you very much. So we're coming to the last part of our webinar. So we've got about 15 minutes left. And we are going to try and have 5 or 10 minutes for some questions. And then I might go back to the panelists for a kind of general closing. But let's have a look at what kind of questions we have coming up from the audience. So we've got one question here, which is around someone who's doing research in climate change and sustainability, and they just want to know how they can integrate their field with climate change and how they can get into climate change careers after the research. So I think, Emma, that might be one for you.
So, for me, and that's a very, very broad question.
Yeah,
But what I would say, and we've heard this from the other panelists as well, is where, you know, where are there the opportunities for those internships, for the fellowships, for making those connections with industry or other scientists during your studies? I think I received an email today from someone asking me this: what sets someone apart
yeah,
in a career afterwards relative to someone else? And it is often the skills and the relationships that they have managed to build through
yeah,
internships, through fellowships, as we've heard about. So, I would encourage them to look and say, what are the, what is the ideal job, or what is the path that they see themselves wanting to take? And
Yeah.
then who's there, who's doing that? Reach out to them on
Yeah.
LinkedIn, send them a tailored email, ask for opportunities, because often it is going to be that networking that allows you to open those doors to then start that translation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Emma. So just going to go to Sam and Adaku as well about some advice in working internationally. Well, working internationally, I think a question for Adaku, and Sam, just some advice about working in policy in country.
Okay, so advice for working internationally, that is very broad. I'm not sure exactly what the person wants to know. Is it how, to navigate it? But I'll say I think how I believe I did it was when I was working in Nigeria. Mostly people from where I'm from, when they want to scale, they'll go to, Canada or the United States or, the United Kingdom. But I wanted to be an Africa expert right from the beginning. I wanted to know my continent like the back of my hand. Because what we do have on this side of the world is where foreigners kind of know our continent better than we do because they've moved around so much and worked in Malawi and Botswana and Angola and think places like that. So when I saw an opportunity for a role in Equatorial Guinea, I applied for it. I couldn't speak Spanish. I couldn't speak French. I'd never been. I didn't know anyone there. But I thought, you know, the international career I want to build starts from home almost, but not home, but kind of adjacent to it. And so I moved to Equatorial Guinea, without knowing anyone. And from there, that was a launch pad to me being able to work across the continent and then build even a global career from that. So I would say for me, I think going where is unexpected, where you can be, a big fish in a small pond helps, and where you can kind of create your own niche and
Yeah.
not feel like everyone else. Because I did something no one from where I'm from did. And in Nigeria, I could be, one in 200 million. But when I went to Equatorial Guinea, I was one of one. And that was very important in giving me a lot of visibility.
Thank you, Adaku. And Sam.
So in terms of getting a job in government, in policy, particularly in climate, I think my main advice would be that there isn't a single route to doing that, and don't feel like because you come from a certain background, academic or professional background, that means that you can't then go into policy. From my perspective, I came from a humanities background, which is quite common in the UK civil service.
Yeah.
And I do strongly advocate for the kinds of skills that you get through the kind of university route, working, the critical thinking, the research. But in every team and department that I've worked in, we have people from all sorts of backgrounds. So we have people coming from the business world, we have people coming from the academic world, from PhDs, etc. We have the tech people with tech skills, and I think policy is the kind of field where you can bring together a lot of those different backgrounds, and it's really about a core set of skills, and a kind of diversity of approaches in tackling problems. So don't, yeah, my main advice would be to don't sort of pigeonhole yourself into thinking, because I come from this career background, I can't move into policy. There's always options. It's about how you kind of frame your experience,
Yeah.
when applying for those jobs.
Great, thank you. So, as we kind of close the webinar, just wanted to ask the panelists, where do you think early career professionals who want to have that impact on climate policy, where do you think they can really effectively contribute in terms of that pathway? Because, early career professionals are, kind of starting out. Do you feel that they can make an impact? So maybe if I go to Sam and then Adaku and then Emma.
I think policy is an area where you can have a really big impact from the start of your career. So when I joined the civil service, I was working on, circular economy policy across the waste sector, having meetings with CEOs when I was in my kind of early 20s. I then led on a £75 million grant program in a tree program. And these are, I think, because these are incredibly complex issues, and you're often dealing with very kind of, the senior stakeholders in business and etc. So I think it's a great opportunity for someone to come in and in the early career and challenge themselves. And I'd go back to my
Yeah.
point around that there isn't a single route to do that. There are,
Yeah.
I mean, in the UK civil service, we have various kind of formal routes. The fast stream is the most famous one of those, which are kind of a leadership scheme for people in their at the start of their careers. We have internships, so you don't have to go through necessarily go through the university route. But then also the civil service in the UK, the way that we do interviews is not on a kind of CV perspective. It's looking at the skills and behaviours that people demonstrate. So it can be very open depending on your experience. And I think policy really benefits from having that diversity of experience coming into the workforce.
Yeah, thank you. And I think from all three of you, from your experience, you really do have that diversity. And, thinking about internships and fellowships and volunteering and networking, these are all essential skills that I think we've really discussed today that can build that experience. Adaku, great to get your thoughts. Oh, I think Adaku, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was saying, I think in this period, I feel like early career professionals can really get ahead much faster than, when I started out like almost 20 years ago. Um, so obviously if you're in the right organization, but because the volume and complexity of climate policy work is so large. I believe right now it has really outpaced the supply of experienced practitioners. There's just not enough people. So if you have a well-prepared junior professional who can research, who can analyze, who can synthesize and communicate clearly, you're never going to be out of a job. And not just as support staff, but like really substantive contributors. So I mean, right now I have interns who they're contributing meaningfully in things like technical research, evidence synthesis, stakeholder mapping, preparation for high-level meetings, data management, drafting policy briefs, etc. And I know, drafting can be underestimated, but listen, if you can produce a clean, well-structured draft that a senior person can work from, rather than rewrite entirely, you become indispensable very, very quickly. So the constraint is usually not opportunity, it's readiness. I've seen the early career professionals who move very quickly, those who are, proactive about understanding the big picture of what the organization is trying to achieve. So not just a specific task they've been assigned, but more of an overarching view.
Thank you. That's been, I think, really encouraging so far, the advice given by Sam and Adaku. I'm going to go to Emma now.
Similar thoughts to both of the panelists. I think the way I synthesize it and it sits to me is if you can have that strategic thinking and that can you could have that as an early professional, but you can look at a pipeline or you can look at discipline or you can look at an area of policy with fresh eyes and bring a diverse perspective, then you have a value to that process and that organization. And so I think I would encourage people to see what is their superpower. I say this, like, everyone's got something they're very good at. People come to me sometimes like, I really love coral reefs and I want to be a scientist, but I'm not very good at science. And I'm like, okay, what are you good at? And they're like, I'm really good at art, or I'm really good at IT or technology. Fantastic. Like, take what you're good at plus your passion, and then that's the way that you can amplify your impact. So I think as early career professionals and researchers and scientists, like, what is it that you're passionate about, what are your strengths and your skill sets, and then use that strategically to see where you can fit in. Because as we've heard from the other two panelists, there is a need, and that diverse perspective, if you can bring those skill sets, will definitely be of value.
Thank you very much. We're just in the last few minutes of the webinar. I think it's been incredibly informative and inspiring to hear all our three panelists. And I think we've really heard that climate policy isn't just shaped by institutions, but by people. And I really hope that the audience today can really see their role in this landscape of climate policy. So I just from the chat that I can see, I think people have been really appreciative of the comments and the topics that we've covered. So we've gone from looking at climate policy landscape to thinking about the career paths, and then to practically think about entry routes and those required skills. And just, I think, not just about feeling discouraged if the technical skills and that pathway feels overwhelming, but really to think about the passion and the social impact, and being part of a wider climate network. So thank you all very, very much today. The third session of today is going to be looking at entrepreneurship, so looking at innovation and scaling impact. So I hope that all of you can stay for that. And it would be great just to give the panelists the last, a kind of final comment as we close today and we say bye. So if I could go to Emma and then Adaku and then Sam, because it's been incredibly inspiring. I've learned a lot today. So if we can have one final reflection from you, that would be great.
It's going to echo the point I just made, which is that, it's with all of the climate anxiety that we feel, irrespective of our disciplines, you come to events like this and you hear that there are a lot of people doing a lot of really positive things, and so we should take that momentum forward and be energized by that, and look at what we can do in our own sphere of influence, because each of us have got capacity to make change, and as a collective we can make some really positive impact. So yeah, thank you for having this. It's great. I've been inspired as well by the other panelists, and I hope that those watching have as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Adaku.
Right. Thank you very much. This has been such a great session. I really enjoyed participating. I think my last word would be, like, I think most people think there isn't an entry point into climate for them, and I do want to say there's an entry point for anyone. Like I mentioned, your transferable skills have nothing to do with your sector. They can be applied anywhere. I mean, if I could go from hydrocarbons to clean energy, I think anybody can do it. So just to say that, find what works for you, find what you can bring to the space, and just do your best while at it.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Sam, just the final word there.
Thanks so much for having me at the session. I don't have loads more to add to the other panelists. I think it's really great to see so much enthusiasm and engagement from everyone in the chat from all around the world. That's really great to see. My only kind of final piece of advice is, as I've said before, don't put yourself in a box. If you start from a position of caring and wanting to do something, you can find a way to use your skills. So keep at it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. And thanks to everyone for joining.